So the title for the lecture is How Christianity Conquered Rome, Early Christian Social Ethics. When we think about the period of what scholars call late antiquity, which broadly speaking ranges from kind of the 2nd century of the Common Era up to maybe the 7th or the 8th century of the Common Era, undoubtedly one of the biggest historical questions, in some way it is the biggest historical question, is how does this thing happen? How is it that Christianity, in the space of such a seemingly short time, 300 years, goes from being a minority sect religion in a kind of backwards part of the empire to eventually dominating the entire Greco-Roman world? How is it that this historical transformation takes place? And one of the things Anna's in my undergraduate class, so she's heard this before. One of the things I emphasize to my undergraduates is that because late antiquity or this period feels so far in the past to us, it's easy to fail to realize the past that already existed up to that point. So at the time that Christianity is coming onto the scene in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, you have a Greco-Roman civilization that's been around for 700-800 years, with Homer being read and studied and commented on and used in educational settings for centuries and centuries and centuries. There's this massive historical context that Christianity comes into, and it's a very new thing. So how is it that this new thing manages to gain such a foothold to eventually dominate its entire world? Well, one way of helping us answer this question is to ask a prior question, and that is, what is religion? So let's think for a minute, and I'll poll the audience in the broadest possible terms. What constitutes a religion? What are the elements that you might expect to have in a religion?
Deity.
Sorry?
A deity.
Right, we need a deity. Good. That's fairly essential. What else?
Priests or something equivalent?
Some kind of a priesthood leadership, right?
Some rules about how you should live your life.
Rules about how you should lead your life. Yes. I knew it wouldn't take long for us to get there. When we think about religion, inevitably ethics or morality is something that shows up fairly quickly in our minds. In fact, for some people today, probably that's what religion is solely, is ethics and morality. But the fact is, that's a very modern construct. One of the things we have to do in scholarship is to question the sorts of assumptions that we bring to things like this, like what is a religion? We think of religion as something that comprises and includes as an intrinsic element ethics or morality, a way of leading your life. But if you were a Roman citizen in the 1st or the 2nd century, that simply wasn't the case. So what Christianity does, and part of the way it manages to accomplish this amazing feat, is it doesn't just lead the Roman citizens of the empire to exchange one religion for another. It in fact fundamentally transforms what we think of religion itself. So it's not just transferring one religion for another, in an exchange kind of fashion, but fundamentally altering what you think of as religion. And it does so by bringing into the picture its Jewish heritage that it draws from its origins. So Guy Strumse, a scholar in Israel who studies these issues quite a lot, said recently, he has lots of quotable lines like this: Christianity conquered Rome, but it did so with Jewish weapons. So the thesis that I want to suggest to you tonight is that the ethical ideals of Christianity, largely taken over from its roots in Judaism, were instrumental in its success in Greco-Roman society. So the fact that we think of ethics as being a part of religion is specifically Christian and Judeo-Christian idea, something that first shows up with Judaism that's then taken over by Christianity. So what about traditional Roman religion then? This is the pantheon in Rome, as some of you maybe already guessed. Well, what are the elements that go into traditional Roman religion? Fundamentally, it's about ritual. It's about doing the right things, offering the right sacrifices on the right day, saying the right words. Roman religion is about ritual, fundamentally. So what that doesn't leave a lot of space for is belief. Now, belief matters. You have to, in some nominal sense at least, affirm the existence of the deities you're sacrificing to, but it's not intrinsic to Roman conceptions of religion in the same way that Christianity does. For Christianity, and this is one of the reasons why Roman officials are so puzzled many times by Christians' refusal to sacrifice. They take their beliefs so seriously. Why is this? Why can't they just add one more God to their existing belief system? Because beliefs weren't as important to traditional Roman religion as we tend to think of them. Also, ethics. Ethics doesn't show up in discussions of traditional Roman religion. Now, there were extensive and complex, sophisticated discussions of ethics in the ancient world, but these occurred in philosophical contexts. That was a discussion of the philosophers carried on in their own schools and from teacher to disciple, but it wasn't something that was brought into play in traditional Roman religion. So you had long-standing ideas like humanity should imitate the gods because the gods are generous and beneficent, and so therefore we should be the same. But that's, again, a philosophical discussion that doesn't really impinge that much on traditional Roman religion, because Roman religion, again, is a matter of ritual, not a matter fundamentally of belief or ethics. To give you one example of this, the Feriale Duranum is a bit of ancient text that was discovered in the city of Dura Europos. Dura Europos was a frontier Roman town in modern-day Syria on the border between Persia and the Roman empires, and because it was a border town, it had a large contingent of the Roman army stationed there. One of the items uncovered in the 1930s when it was being excavated was this list of Roman army religion feasts and festivals that were to be celebrated, and it includes things like this. Sacrifice, 4 days before the Ides of May, for the games of Mars, to Father Mars, the Avenger, you sacrifice a bull. Similarly, again, sacrifice 1 day before the calends of September, for the birthday of the divine Commodus, and to the divine Commodus a male ox. So it gives you what day you're supposed to sacrifice on, what deity you're supposed to sacrifice to, and what it is that you're supposed to sacrifice. It's about ritual, it's about getting these elements in the right order, not primarily a matter of ethics or how you live your life. I'll give you another example. The Suo Vittorilia. This is one of the most sacred and traditional of Roman rites. You would sacrifice, as you can see in the picture, a bull, a sheep, and a pig to the deity Mars. And there's very specific instructions of what you were to do as you undertake this sacrifice. So, for example, you would initially lead the three animals around the field that you're blessing or sacrificing to, saying certain words as you do so. And then just before the sacrifice, you would pray, Father Mars, I pray and beseech thee that thou be gracious and merciful to me, my house, and my household. To which intent I have bidden this Suo Vittorilia to be led around my land, my ground, my farm, that thou keep away, ward off, and remove sickness, seen and unseen, barrenness and destruction, ruin and unseasonable influence, and that thou permit my harvests, my grain, my vineyards, and my plantations to flourish, and to come to good issue, preserve in health my shepherds and my flocks, and give good health and strength to me, my house, and my household. To this intent, to the intent of purifying my farm, my land, my ground, and of making an expiation, as I have said, deign to accept the offering of these suckling victims. So Roman religion, as I've said, is about ritual and about sacrifice. What then about Christianity? Well, some of our earliest Christian texts that we have, even in the New Testament themselves, as you might know if you have much awareness with them, make a great deal of ethics. And they do so largely or often in the context of baptism. We might not immediately think of baptism when we think of ethics, but for early Christians, this is one of the most fundamental sites, the place at which you would encounter early Christian ethics. One of the definitions, the closest thing you get almost to a definition of baptism in the New Testament is 1 Peter 3:21. Baptism now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience. This, by the way, is the image is, well, does anyone want to guess? Is there anyone in the room that might know offhand what the image is? I mentioned a moment ago Dura Europos, the city in modern-day Syria, Roman frontier town. Dura Europos is also famous because it contains the earliest Christian church ever to be uncovered, dating to the 230s to the 250s. And this was originally a house that was converted into a church and then used as a public setting for Christian worship. And it included a baptistry. So what you see in the back here with the arches is the actual basin filled with water that would be used for baptism. So it's the earliest Christian house church and the earliest Christian baptistry as well. Now getting back to 1 Peter 3:21, baptism is that which saves you as an appeal to God for a good conscience. The word used here for appeal is rather, what's not a great translation in English that captures what's going on in Greek. The word in Greek is eperotema, which was a word that was commonly used in legal transactions. So if you, and we know this from the papyri that have been dug up from Egypt, for example, if you were undertaking a legal transaction, a business transaction of some form, there would be a formal kind of oath that would close the ceremony in which a question would be asked and then a response would be given, a confession would be given. And this entire transaction, especially this oath at the end, sealing it with legal binding force, was called an eperotema, which is the same word that 1 Peter is using here to describe baptism as. And in fact, it's not very far and very similar, in fact, to the meaning of the Latin word sacramentum, which was also the word used for the oath that Roman soldiers would make upon their enlistment to be devoted to the empire and to the emperor. So we're in the realm of when 1 Peter calls baptism an appeal to God for a good conscience, what it's describing baptism as is a binding commitment, a covenant-like commitment that the one undergoing baptism makes to carry out a certain form of life. And in fact, you see this even in 1 Peter, because 1 Peter exhorts the recipients of the letter again and again to do things like maintain a good conscience among those among whom you're living. So baptism is the site at which this commitment to a kind of ethical way of life is initially undertaken. And again, just to emphasize Guy Strums's point, this is a fundamentally Jewish idea. We can point to parallels such as the document called the Community Rule of Qumran. This is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in the mid-20th century. And it's a very lengthy document laying out very specific instructions for those who want to become a part of this community. And it begins, everyone who wishes to join this community must pledge himself to respect God and man, to live according to the communal rule, to seek God, to do what is good and upright in his sight. So if you wanted to join this sectarian community in the Judean desert, you had to agree to abide by this rule. It's a way of life. And agreeing to do so was understood as a form of conversion. Early Christian views of baptism are not fundamentally that different from this. It's a commitment to joining a certain community and thereby also agreeing to abide by a certain manner of life. One of the earliest baptismal formulas that we can find is known as the 2 A's tradition. And it shows up in a couple of different documents. And this is the sort of thing that would have been given to those who were being prepared for baptism. Basic instructions in kind of moral or ethical behavior. There are 2 ways, one of life and one of death, and there's a great difference between these 2 ways. And then it goes on to give, again, a list of instructions like you find among these Jewish texts at Qumran. Now this is the way of life. First, you shall love God who made you. Second, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But whatever you do not wish to happen to you, do not do to one another. To perhaps remind you of some of the language of the New Testament that you're familiar with. But the way of death is this: murders, adulteries, lusts, sexual immoralities, thefts, idolatries. It is the way of those who have no mercy for the poor, do not work on behalf of the oppressed, who turn away from someone in need, who oppress the afflicted. So early Christian views of baptism in sort of the 1st and 2nd centuries and thereafter was an agreement to abide by a certain manner of life, summarized in rules like this, which are similar to what we find at Qumran and elsewhere. This is what it meant to be baptized. And we're also, thankfully, can find further confirmation of this from what might be an unexpected source. Pliny the Younger was a Roman official traveling through Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, in the early decades of the 2nd century, and he comes across a problem. In one of these towns, there's Christians in these towns who stopped sacrificing to such a degree that it's impacting the local economy, and people are getting really upset about it. What are we to do? And so Pliny's not quite sure. He's never really encountered this sort of situation before. So he writes back to the Emperor Trajan to ask for advice. And Pliny gives us a description of what he thinks of as an outsider, his own view of what's going on in this odd sort of community that he's unfamiliar with. He describes how he investigated and even under torture examined some of the members of this community to discern exactly what was going on. And his description of early Christian piety that he encounters is strikingly similar to what we've seen thus far. The Christians, he says, were accustomed to bind themselves by oath, which again reminds us of what we saw in 1 Peter and the sacramentum, the kind of oath that Roman military officers would take. The Christians bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, nor falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. So Pliny gives us supporting evidence from someone who's not a Christian, someone outside the Christian fold, to the fact that early on, we're less than 100 years after the life of Jesus, Christians are defining themselves as a community based on a certain manner of life, which, as I said earlier, was different from Roman understandings of what religion constituted. Well, let's make it a little bit more specific. Charity in the Roman world. It's not as though the Romans had no space for charity or almsgiving. They certainly did, and this is a key part of Roman society. So let's spend the rest of the lecture thinking through a little bit how Roman understandings of this differed from what the Christians brought to the surrounding world. Charity did exist in the Roman world, and it was carried out through the mechanism of systems of patronage. So if you had great wealth in the Roman Empire, it's not as, well, actually I wonder if this might be a slight difference between America and the UK. Perhaps some of you could comment on that later if this is interesting. But in the US at least, if you have a great deal of money, there might be some kind of loose or low-level societal expectation that you use that for the good of others. But there's also a sense that that's yours and you're free to do with it whatever you want. So if you happen to be particularly well endowed, well, that's fine. That's up to you. You get to use your money how you see fit. In the Roman world, though, it wasn't the case. If you were exceptionally wealthy, you were expected to use that wealth for the good of the city in which you find yourself. So you're meant to, the expectation is that you become a channel through which this money is carried out for the good of other people, for the city. And so you find descriptions of this, the crazed expenditure as a source of glory, is a phrase from Augustine in one of his descriptions of this. But the key thing was there was an exchange that took place. So when the wealthy individual gave to the city, he received something in exchange. He received honor and glory. So that's the exchange that's taking place there. There's an expenditure and outlay of wealth, and in exchange, this person is lauded and praised by those who are receiving it. So Augustine describes, driven crazy by this and puffed up with pride, they even wish to lose their fortunes by giving to actresses, giving to cabaret artists, giving to wild beast hunters, giving to charioteers. They pour forth not only their inherited resources, but their very souls. They draw back with disgust from the poor, because the people do not shout for the poor to receive largesse, but the people roar for the venator, the matador, to have his prize. So Augustine gives you a sense of these wealthy individuals loved their the praise they received, the glory they received from the city so much that they were willing to impoverish themselves for the good of others. Another contemporary of Augustine, John Chrysostom, who initially lived in Antioch and then moved to the eastern capital of Constantinople, provides us with a similar account. Chrysostom's one of the most vivid of early Christian preachers. He says, "The theater is full, and all the people, sitting right up to the top, present a brilliant spectacle composed of so many faces that even the roof and the undergirding rafters are largely obscured by the bodies. In the sight of all these people enters the man who has gathered them together out of the love of honor. Immediately they spring to their feet and raise a shout as though from a single mouth. In unison they call him guardian and patron of their common city, stretching out their hands." Because this is the individual that's paid for the games that they're sitting there about to enjoy. And so they're acknowledging his generosity in putting on these games. Then, having bowed low to the people and thus in turn honored them, the great man sits down amidst the congratulations of his peers, each of whom prays that he too may have this experience and then straightway die. So the individual, after being lauded by the entire theater, goes and sits down amongst the other wealthy aristocrats who are in jealousy of the praise that he's just received, and then wish that they might be able to so impoverish themselves. So there was giving that went on in the Roman world, but the basic difference between that and what Christianity brought is that the giving that took place in Greco-Roman society was an exchange of wealth directed, and the wealth was given not for the poor indiscriminately, but for the citizens of the city. So all of this, the wealth that Augustine and Chrysostom are describing that are being given out, breads and circuses is one way it's commonly described. They're giving out doles of bread and grain for those in the city, putting on games for those in the city. This isn't generosity that's directed towards the poor as such. It's directed towards the city, and it's directed towards especially the citizens of the city. So if you want to receive the grain dole in the city of Rome, it's not enough simply to be a poor person. You have to be a citizen of the city, a different kind of class of person. That's the exchange that's taking place. What Christianity does is turn this on its head by bringing the poor into view as a class. So Jesus famously says, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God." If you imagine yourself as an Augustine or a Chrysostom in the end of the 4th century, how are you going to explain the Christian faith to these wealthy individuals that are used to receiving such praise and glory for giving their wealth so extravagantly for the city, for the building of baths and the putting on of games and the building of theaters and the giving of grain and so forth? What are you going to do? Well, the solution they come up with, how is it that you're to make it through the eye of the needle, is by giving to the poor rather than giving to the city. I've given a quote here from the letter of James in the New Testament, which gives us a different sense of what religion is from the Roman religion we considered earlier. James says, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world." And it's no accident that we turn to James for this, because James is one of the most Jewish of our early Christian documents in the New Testament. So James is reflecting a very Jewish idea when he says this. So what exactly did this look like? Well, we know from our historical sources, but by the mid-3rd century, the Church of Rome cared for a list of 1,500 widows and those in need. Just imagine, if you will, the administrative apparatus that's required to maintain a list of this size, know who's on the list and who's off the list, and to provide the distribution of funds to care for such a large group of people. So one historian, Peter Brown, explains this as heaven and earth were brought together through the Christian gift. By giving, Christians, the wealthy who gave to the church, to the poor, through the church, were able to attain eternal salvation through their gifts. So we mentioned a moment ago that Roman charity was directed to the citizen by the wealthy individuals. What Christianity brought into view was the poor itself. So the kind of polarity of citizen and non-citizen is replaced by the polarity of the rich and the poor. It's no longer the wealthy giving to the citizens of the city, to the civic community. It's now the rich giving to the poor, and thereby going through the eye of the needle. Well, we can get a little bit more specific as well, because Basil of Caesarea established the first Christian hospital, in fact. And we're used to thinking of hospitals today. Hospitals in the ancient world, though, simply did not exist, with one exception. The only real exception are hospitals that existed for the Roman army, which were around for a while, but certainly nothing like what we would think of as hospitals today. They were limited in those in who they served, largely just Roman military officers and perhaps slaves as well. The invention of the hospital is a Christian idea. It first shows up in the late 4th century through Basil's work and several others as well. It begins initially in a famine. So in 368 or 370, there's a famine in Basil's part of the world. And Basil exhorts the wealthy members of his congregation to open to the world that dark cave of mammon, the hungry are wasting away before your face. So what seems to have been happening is because there was a famine on, the wealthy who had their own stores of grain were hoarding that away because clearly in a famine, food becomes much more valuable. So they're storing it away for their own profit rather than giving it to those who are in dire need. Basil calls on those individuals in his congregation to release this grain that they're hoarding away, and rather than seeking their own wealth, to give it to the poor that are dying before them. But the key thing is that this begins initially as a measure towards famine relief in the face of a severe famine, but it eventually becomes a permanent institution and even takes its name after Basil himself. And after he dies, it lives on beyond him and becomes the prototype of the first hospital. One of Basil's friends upon his death said, "In this new city lay the common treasury for those with possessions, even what people need to live on, a place where disease is studied philosophically and where compassion is held in genuine esteem." Basil's hospital included the soup kitchen, in which he himself worked alongside his clergy. Gregory of Nazianzus, who gives us a description of it, says that it wasn't just supporting Christians who were poor and who were starving. There were Jews and others who were supported at this hospital as well. And it goes on and becomes a key aspect of, or is a common feature of Eastern monasticism after this point. So hospitals begin springing up after this point, especially throughout the East, through the efforts of Basil and others. They support orphans, they establish separate establishments for lepers and so forth. It's not exactly a hospital like we would think of it today. It's more a kind of cross between a hostel and something like a hospital, but it's the forerunner of the modern hospital, the closest thing that existed at the time. And again, this is a new Christian idea that comes onto the scene, and it comes about because Christians have this new idea that you're meant to be giving to the poor, not just giving to the city. Finally, we have, again, further supporting evidence for this from someone who himself wasn't a Christian. Although, well, in this case was and turned against it. Emperor Julian, known as the Apostate, who reigned from 361 to 363. Julian was raised as a Christian, had some of the best Christian tutors you could have had in the day, but in his adult life decided to turn against it. And when he became emperor, instituted this attempt to turn the empire back to paganism. So Constantine had been, Christianity initially became listed about half a century prior to this, so we've had 50 years of Christians living largely in freedom of persecution. But Julian decided to turn back the tide and make the empire pagan again. And this isn't an easy thing to do. So he starts trying to establish priesthoods throughout the empire and writes to these priests to tell them how they're meant to go about doing this. So he says, this is in one of his letters to a pagan high priest. Julian says, "When it came about that the poor were neglected and overlooked by the pagan priests, then I think the impious Galileans," that's his word of contempt or name for the Christians, "these impious Galileans observed this fact and devoted themselves to philanthropy." So the poor are neglected, Julian says. The Christians see this as an opportunity and decide to use this and exploit this fact by devoting themselves to philanthropy. Julian goes on to say they support not only their poor, but ours as well. All men see that our people lack aid from us. So Julian, as someone who's not a Christian, recognizes that Christian concern for the poor is one of the appealing things that others see about the movement. And then finally he says, in every city they establish frequent hospitals, the same word Basil uses for his, that were connected to these monasteries, in order that strangers may benefit from our benevolence. Whoever is in need, for it is disgraceful that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well, our own people should seem destitute of support from us. So Julian tries to bring about the institution of a system of pagan charity comparable to what he's observed among the Christians. He dies before this can get very far along the way, but he gives us further supporting evidence that what the Christians brought into the Roman Empire was something that was new, something that was a transformation of religion itself. So Christianity conquered the Roman world, at least partly through the new ethical sense that it gave to late antiquity, bringing into play the Jewish heritage that it received. So that's the end of the lecture. I think we have a good bit of time left for questions, so we can chat about this further if you want. There is a formal, I know some people are eager to get off to as well, but we have a bit of time if someone would like to raise questions.
May I ask a question? Thanks very much. It was really interesting and very helpful. I wonder what was distinctively attractive about Christian ethics that made them superior to the ethics of the philosophers, because you conceded there were ethical systems, but not within Roman religion, which was ritual based. So I just wonder what was the engine that made Christian ethics so attractive, especially because those ethics were already implicit within Judaism.
Right.
So I'm just wondering what the trigger was.
Yeah, it's a great question. The way people often describe this is that Christianity takes what's there present in Judaism and universalizes it and spreads it over a much larger scale. So philosophical communities are something that is a very elite thing. I mean, not your average Roman citizen isn't necessarily someone who even has that as an option to go off and join a philosophical school, because he has to worry about where he's going to get his bread for the next day, perhaps. So philosophy remains a very elite thing. One of the things that Christians begin boasting of early on, already in the 2nd century, by the end of the 2nd century, you have this, is that anyone can philosophize among them for free of charge. So they're not charging for this kind of training and this instruction. So there's a sort of democratization, I think, that takes place with Christianity, which wasn't the case previously with the philosophical schools, or really with Judaism, because Judaism is a nationally, ethnically focused thing. And one of the things that Christians realize early on, again from the earliest Christian texts we have, is they emphasize the fact that they're not limited to one nation. They're a stranger in every nation, and in every nation they find a home, is the sort of language that they use, because they're a kind of third race between the Jews and the pagans, not limited to a specific ethnic group. So there's a universalizing, I think, that takes place that shifts it into a different register from what's there before. Does that help answer the question? You may have thoughts on this as well.
Well,
perhaps.
I think I just sat here thinking, but how about things like the cynics, who were on every street corner? And what about places like the Areopagus, which was open to the public and where people were commonly talking about philosophical issues? I just wonder if you slightly overstated the distinction.
So, do you have other thoughts then about what's the key shift then? What's the trigger, as it were, if it's not that?
I wonder if it's monotheism.
How so?
Okay, this is your lecture.
Right. Well, so I mean, the other thing that you find in Christianity that isn't there in Judaism, you already find this in the letters of Paul, for example, is that Christian ethics is founded in the act of Jesus. So there's a self-giving, self-offering that's there in the earliest DNA of Christianity that you simply don't have anything quite comparable in paganism. And to some degree that has to be the engine that's driving this. And you certainly find this even in later authors like Maximus the Confessor. Maximus has this commentary on the Divine Liturgy. Maximus is a 7th century Byzantine author, and he gives this explanation in the densest metaphysical terms, the highest flying theological exposition of what's going on in the liturgy. And then he gets to the very end of it and he says something like, well, then how do we know that this is affecting us? What's the sign? And his answer is, are you caring for the poor man on the street, as Jesus did? So it's there already in Paul. He became poor for us so that we might become rich, and therefore we then, in imitation of him, give as well, so that we become poor as well like him, so that we too can become rich. So that's something that I think is also new, that's a part of this. Other questions?
So, pragmatic question, I guess, is the caring for the poor from the rich to the hospitals. How did the transaction of money, of the giving, take place? Like, was it? So I'm thinking in very modern context. Was it? Wasn't taxation, obviously. So how was it? Do we have any indication as to how that interaction took place, and whether the giving to the hospitals was a caring for the poor, if that makes sense? Or is it like the giving of alms outside of the gates of the church house or the temple?
The hospital supported the poor. If that's, and they had a soup kitchen where they were giving out food to those during the famine, things like that. The way the transaction took place is that the bishops became increasingly to fill the role of the patron in the older system. So Basil even famously gets in trouble with the emperor because he uses the money that the emperor gave in a way that the emperor wasn't too happy with to support the poor. So the bishops, church leaders, become kind of holders for this money that the rich give to the church, which then is distributed to the poor. So they're kind of the managers in a transaction in which they're not the true owners of the wealth. They're simply seen as being the kind of stewards of the wealth that properly belongs to God. Does that address your question? Yep.
Can I ask you about, because you were going to talk about modern relevance and so on,
Mm-hmm.
are there universals in this story? Because it strikes me there were actually quite a lot of parallels with the Reformation of the 16th century, with a big, over-bloated Catholic church that is painted by the newcomers as not looking after the needs of its own people. There is, a kind of small sets of groups of small, mobile people who are good at propaganda and good at kind of painting the Catholic Church as bad and so on. And I wonder if there are many religious transitions that have some of these features.
Probably so. I mean, one of the, thinking in terms of giving a social historical description of this, one of the things Christianity manages to do is find a marginalized group, the poor, that are not looked after, don't have much of an identity that we can view, at least in our historical record, co-opt them, and then use that as a means to the eventual takeover of the empire. There's more going on there than simply that. I don't think it can be reduced to social forces, but that's a part of it. And so the co-opting of marginalized groups to support new religious movements to then affect great change might be one similarity between those two. And you have the Peasants' War shortly after the Reformation as well, right? So there was something that vaguely similar, at least, going on in that respect.
I, in a sense, was thinking along the same lines and partly building on Anthony's question, but Anthony walked out of my office today with a book on tipping points. And in a way, it's the same sort of thing about, what was it that I was thinking more in terms of what was it that suddenly Christianity went from a sort of rather marginal sect and suddenly it was 300 years, but something took it from being pretty marginalised to being pretty central. And you've, in a way, shown us what was involved in that, but maybe not all of the triggers that involve that. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about what happened in that 300 years that suddenly shot it forward to this position of prominence.
Yeah, maybe I should have given a bigger or clearer caveat. I don't intend this to be the sole explanation for complex historical change, but this is one key difference I think we can point to between the old and the new that Christianity brings about. There's other things that go on as well. One of the other most fundamental changes is the ending of sacrifice. So ancient societies are built around the sacrifice of animals, like we talked about with Roman religion and the rites that constituted it. Christianity affects a spiritualizing of that also happens around the same time in Judaism with the destruction of the temple. So the spiritualizing and interiorization of sacrifice gives rise to, historians say, a new sense of the self. So the sense of the self, of what constitutes a human person in care of the self, changes around this time. And another key part of that is this interiorization and spiritualization of sacrifice. So what matters now is introspection, what's going on in the soul, rather than simply performing a ritual. And Guy Strumsa has this sentence, it's overdrawn, but it makes the point that the most important event in the development of European culture is the destruction of the Temple of the Jews in 70 AD by the Romans. Because the destruction of the temple meant that the Jews couldn't sacrifice any longer, and so they had to come up with some new interpretation of what sacrifice was. Christians do much the same thing, partly as a result of the same event. So changing understandings of what sacrifice is and how that gives rise to a new sense of the human person and the human individual are other key forces that are going on, I think.
Can I just follow that with a sort of rejoinder then, if I may, in that it follows on from the sort of what you were saying about the poor. I just wondered whether it was enough that, in a sense, this became a sort of mass. I don't know whether the poor were, presumably they were involved in the religion, but whether this was a sort of mass. Was it enough that the poor were involved, or did it still need the rich and the powerful to draw it through and create the success?
Well, in Christianity, before Constantine's conversion, it's no longer simply a marginal sect. Like, even before the elites of the empire are converting on a large scale, it's already managed to achieve an astonishing degree of success. Partly as a result of new ideas that it brings, partly as a result of the new ethics that it brings. But what happens in the 4th century is really the tipping point towards the entire empire becoming Christian. And Constantine isn't as important in that as we sometimes portray. He is important, but the real tipping point, people now say, happens around the 360s when the aristocracy of the empire begin coming in en masse. And you have things happening that have never happened before. Some of the richest individuals of the empire who owned lands and estates, and tens of thousands of slaves begin converting to Christianity and divesting themselves of their wealth and giving it to the church. So it's when that happens more towards the end of the 4th century that the status of the church really begins to shift, and the church for the first time can present itself as a true alternative to the classical city. So rather than giving to the city to establish a new bath or a new theater, you might rather instead give to the church so that that money can be used for the poor or for the building of the church itself, and then you have your name inscribed on the church instead of being inscribed on the seats in the theater that you've paid for. So it's at the end of the 4th century that socially this change happens, and economics are a big part of that.
Interesting. Thank you.
Probably have time for a few more if there are any.
If there aren't any more questions for now, perhaps if you're sticking around for a bit to ask
Sure.
any questions, or
Yep.
we can get in contact with you. If we could give a huge round of applause to Dr. Matthew. We hope you've enjoyed the talk. Thank you to all of you for coming, particularly on a Friday night. Before you go, if you could take 2 minutes to quickly fill out the questionnaire that we've provided for you, that'd be greatly appreciated. This is one of the talks of the Hatfield Shaped programme. So all the feedback that you will write, we'll be using to improve the quality of our talks and service for you guys. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and thank you again.
Thanks.
Dr. Matthew Crawford. Thank you.